In this video, I'm going to share a parable that is a metaphor for human communication. I learned about this parable early in grad school, and I wish that I had learned about it earlier in my life because it now permeates communication in all of my life. How I talk and how I listen and how I teach, how I communicate with my friends and my family. This parable exists in the world of humanities and linguistics, so a bit different from the genres that we've typically studied in this class. The parable is the toolmaker's paradigm. It was originally published in 1979 in an anthology called Metaphor and Thought, in a chapter by author and professor Michael Reddy. I have modified Reddy's original story slightly to modernize and to shorten it. These slides that you'll see are from Dr. Glenn Dolphin at University of Calgary, who has generously granted me permission to use them for this video. You can access them at this link, and I will also put it below. Okay, the parable goes like this. Imagine a huge compound, shaped like a wagon wheel. Each pie-shaped sector of the wheel is an environment, separated by the spokes and the circumference of the wheel. These environments have some commonalities: water, trees, small plants, rocks. However, they are not all exactly the same. Some are more rocky, some have more forest, one has a lake. And in each sector is one person who must survive their own special environment. While each person knows of the existence of the people in the other environments, they cannot see or hear or touch or in any way directly directly experience the other environments. They can't visit, they can't go through the walls. In fact, the only way that they can communicate is through this hub in the center of the wheel. This is illustrated here by this magical gem. And through this magical communication device in the center, they can exchange notes with a pencil and a paper on which they could write blueprints and sketches. This is the only method of communication that they have. So, suppose the person in the more wooded environment, lots of trees, has invented a tool that is very useful to them. Let's call this person Wally. I made up these names. This is my addition to the story because I didn't want to keep saying person A and person B. So Wally for wooded environment. Let's say Wally learns to build a rake, and they find they can use it to clear the dead plants, the debris, without damaging the other plants in the environment. And Wally's very, very proud of themselves. So they go to the hub, draw 3 identical sets of instructions for the rake, and send it off to the other 3. The other 3 people receive the plans. What do they do after seeing the sketches? So the person in the area with the lake comes up with a gaff. Right, you can see this person in the middle, the hook, really great for fishing. The person in the swamp comes up with a hoe, really good for slicing cleanly through the roots of marshy areas. And here, on the left, the person in the rocky terrain, and let's give this person a name, let's call them Ray for Rocky, gets the instructions and starts building the rake and starts building the head of the rake out of stone instead of wood. Ray realizes it is really big and heavy and starts to marvel at how big and strong Wally must be to be able to lift up this rake that's made out of stone. Knowing that Ray cannot possibly lift up this rake made of stone like they think Wally can, Ray decides to create a double-bladed rock pick, which is useful for unearthing rocks in their environment. So all 3 of these people draw their own sketches of what they made, their tools, send the blueprints of their tools back through the communication hub and back to Wally. And Wally gets them and thinks, what are these tools? This is not the rake that I sent. This is not useful to me. So here, let's stop. Right? The original parable keeps going, gives more detail about what happens between the communication and between Wally and Ray, or person A and person B. But I'd like to stop here for a moment and discuss the metaphor. So each environment, each sector is our own mind. Only we can experience our own mind. Others cannot come in to see what we are seeing. And the only way that we can communicate about our environment is through symbols, symbols of language, words. Humans have gotten very good at these symbols, and we've developed these complex systems of language, and we often take these words as second nature. So in English, and likely other languages as well, but this metaphor was specifically written for English, we often speak of our language in terms of a conduit. So maybe you've heard of the conduit metaphor before, or maybe not. The conduit metaphor is the idea that we have a direct connection, right? That implicitly we view our words and our ideas as items, things that can be packed up into a box, packaged up, delivered across a conduit. And all that person must do when they hear them is just retrieve them, open the box, unpack it, and take it out as its original form, a whole unalterable object. So in the chapter, Reddy spends several pages explaining examples of this metaphor, which gets very complex. I've put the first three that he uses up here that give of how English continues to convince us that the conduit metaphor is real. Let's try to get your thoughts across better. Came through. Mary's feelings came through. Or you still haven't given me any idea of what you mean. Okay, so back to this assumption that our words are whole, unalterable objects. This assumption is faulty. Right? The meaning of our words are context-specific and person-specific. A listener cannot just unpack like a box. They must actually construct their own meaning from what they're hearing and what they're seeing. And this meaning is only based on their existing knowledge and their existing experiences. So this is a problem. This faulty assumption that listeners have the ability to merely unpack the words and the symbols given to them is a problem. So to see why, let's return to our story and let's look at the next chapter. So we have a new character, a wizard's apprentice, who is watching all this communication in the hub take place. By the way, the original story calls this wizard an evil magician. So you have a wizard's apprentice, they see the difficulty in the communications and they see the frustrations when each person is trying to understand the blueprints of each other's ideas, and so the wizard wants to help and decides that the best way to do this is to make them forget all the work that they went through writing those diagrams or following the directions. The wizard casts a spell so that they forget the work involved in understanding the blueprints. And instead, the wizard plants a false memory that the object itself, the rake, has been sent to them directly from the other person, right, through some marvelous mechanism in the communication hub. So instead of having to build it themselves, it's as if they actually got a rake from the communication system, right? Of course, this is not true, right? Each person still has to build the objects themselves out of their own materials, out of their own knowledge. But the wizard blinded them to this. So what happens? When the inhabitants forget that they themselves have constructed the tool based on their own environments and knowledge, the inhabitants forget about their own responsibility in building the tool and instead blame the sender. it's not long before the communication system completely breaks down. If we live in the wizard's world and we forget the work it takes to communicate with symbols, we, like the inhabitants of the story, will start to blame others. As Reddy puts it on page 186, it was not long before each of the persons came to entertain privately the idea that all the others had gone insane. So the wizard in this parable is the English language, and the English language's bias in convincing us that our thoughts are communicated directly to others through the conduit metaphor, with little to no work involved in understanding them. So this model, this idea of the conduit metaphor, this model of communication objectifies meaning in a misleading and dehumanizing fashion. I'm reading this quote to you right now, directly from the chapter. It influences us to talk and think about thoughts as if they had the same kind of external intersubjective reality as lamps and tables. And then, when this faulty presumption proves dramatically false in operation, there seems to be nothing left to blame except our own stupidity or malice. Thus, when our communication fails, right, we tend to blame the sender or the receiver rather than the symbols in the language. And instead of questioning and discussing and revising our blueprints so that real communication can actually take place, we think we failed. And we stop and we give up. So your takeaways. 1, written and verbal communication always takes place with symbols. Symbols for understanding, and these symbols are always subjective and dependent on prior experiences. Effective communication, therefore, takes work. Both the listener and the speaker have a shared responsibility for finding shared meaning. This is pertinent to you in any situation that demands careful understanding and good communication, and is perhaps even more paramount in interdisciplinary collaboration, which you will all do at some point because the nature of digital culture demands it. I hope that this parable serves you well as a framework for understanding how humans communicate, and therefore is helpful to you on your learning journey as you navigate and make sense of the blueprints that you receive.